Welcome to my channel.
The wind off the Atlantic didn't just blow through Lochdubh. It seemed to hold a personal grudge against anyone with the audacity to be outdoors. It was a thin wind, the kind that sliced through heavy wool and settled deep in the marrow. Inside the police station, however, PC Hamish Macbeth was engaged in a delicate battle with a peat fire that showed a stubborn Highland reluctance to catch. Hamish sighed, his tall, lanky frame folded into a chair that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was particularly unruly this morning, and his hazel eyes were clouded with the pleasant haze of a man who had absolutely no intention of doing any work. Beside him, Lugs, his lop-eared dog of uncertain pedigree, gave a sympathetic thump of his tail against the floorboards. "It's a day for the stove and a pot of coffee, Lugs," Hamish murmured. "Not for the chasing of villains who are, no doubt, too sensible to be out in this anyway." The peace of Lochdubh was a fragile thing, usually preserved by Hamish's carefully cultivated reputation for being utterly useless. If the authorities in Strathbane thought he was a threat to the crime statistics, they might promote him. And promotion meant a city. A city meant noise, crowds, and, worst of all, an officer in charge who expected him to wear a tie and polish his shoes daily. His quiet contemplation was rudely interrupted by the roar of a high-performance engine echoing off the whitewashed cottages of the village. Hamish wandered to the window, pulling aside the frayed curtain. A silver Bentley, looking like a sleek shark in a pond of trout, had squeezed itself into a space meant for a tractor outside the Lochdubh Hotel. Out stepped Julian Vane Tempest. Even from 20 yards away, the man radiated an aura of expensive tweed and unearned confidence. He was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, the kind who bought a holiday estate and immediately began telling the locals how to run their sheep. "He's back, Hamish," groaned, "and he's brought that New Year's Eve party with him." Vane Tempest had recently purchased the old Macrae house on the cliffside, renaming it the Heights and installing a security gate that the locals viewed as a direct challenge to their right to wander. He had invited a select group of London friends for a Hogmanay celebration, promising them a raw, authentic Highland experience, which usually meant drinking too much expensive gin while complaining about the lack of high-speed internet. The phone on Hamish's desk began to shrill. He stared at it with the weary patience of a man watching a fly buzz against a window pane. It was likely DCI Blair calling from Strathbane to bark about some missing paperwork, or perhaps Mrs. Kennedy complaining that a stray sheep was looking at her judgmentally. Hamish picked up his hat, tucked his whistle into his pocket, and whistled for Lugs. "If we aren't here, we can't be told to do anything," he told the dog. "I think there's a salmon in the Curlow burn that's been asking for an invitation to my poaching bag, and the hotel will have the heating on by now." As he stepped out into the biting air, he saw Julian Vane Tempest shouting at the hotel porter about the weight of a suitcase. Hamish slouched his shoulders, fixed a look of vacant bewilderment on his face, and began to saunter in the opposite direction. The storm was coming in, the sky turning the colour of a bruised plum, and Hamish had a sinking feeling that the Sassenach's party was going to bring more than just noise to the quiet shores of the loch. Hamish managed to avoid the Bentley and its owner by slipping down the narrow lane behind the post office, but his hope of a peaceful poaching expedition was short-lived. By the time the sun had begun to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Sullivan, casting long, eerie shadows across the heather, the wind had picked up a frantic, howling quality. He was halfway to the burn when the distant, rhythmic tolling of the village bell reached his ears, a sound rarely heard unless there was a fire or a disaster. With a heavy sigh and a pat for Lugs, Hamish turned back toward the village, his dreams of poached salmon replaced by a familiar, nagging dread. The scene at the Lochdubh Hotel was one of organised chaos. A crowd of locals had gathered in the biting cold, their faces illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the hotel's porch lights. In the centre of the driveway, Julian Vane Tempest's silver Bentley sat with its driver's side door flung wide, but it wasn't the car that held everyone's attention. It was the large, ornate ice sculpture of a Highland stag, intended as the centrepiece for the New Year's Eve gala, which had been moved from the ballroom to the frozen lawn. Pinioned beneath the heavy melting block of ice was the body of Julian Vane Tempest himself. He was dressed in a flamboyant silk dressing gown, his face frozen in a mask of indignant surprise. The way he was positioned, pinned by the haunches of the crystal stag, made it look as though the ice creature had finally had enough of his arrogance and decided to sit on him. It was a bizarre, slightly humiliating end for a man who had spent his life looking down on others. "Right then, move along, there's nothing to see but a dead Englishman," a voice boomed. Hamish winced as Archie MacLean, the local publican, tried to usher the gawking villagers away. Hamish stepped forward, his tall figure casting a long shadow over the macabre scene. He knelt by the body, ignoring the biting cold seeping through his trousers. Lugg sniffed the air and let out a low, mournful whine. Hamish noticed immediately that while the ice stag was heavy, it hadn't fallen on Julian from a height, it had been dragged. There were deep ruts in the frost-covered grass, and Julian's silk slippers were missing. One of his bare feet was blue with cold, while the other was tucked neatly under the ice. "He's dead as a salted herring, Hamish," muttered Willie. Lamont, the village's part-time fireman, who was shivering nearby, found him like that 10 minutes ago. "The guests are all inside screaming for gin and lawyers." Hamish didn't answer. He was looking at the way Julian's hand was outstretched, clutching a small silver cocktail skewer. It seemed a pitiful weapon for a man who had been crushed by his own party decorations. "Aye, it's a mess, Willie," Hamish said softly, his Highland lilt thickening as it always did when he wanted to appear less sharp than he was. "A terrible way to go, being flattened by your own hospitality." He stood up and surveyed the hotel windows. Faces peered out from the warmth of the lounge, wealthy, frightened faces from the city. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of a siren began to drift over the hills from the direction of Strathbane. Hamish felt a familiar tightening in his chest. That would be DCI Blair, no doubt coming to bring his own particular brand of loud-mouthed incompetence to the Highlands. Hamish looked down at Julian one last time. He noticed a small, dark smudge on the collar of the silk dressing gown, a smudge that smelled faintly of expensive motor oil and cheap peppermint. It was a small detail, the kind of thing the forensic teams from the city would likely overlook in their rush to blame a local poacher or a disgruntled servant. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish whispered, pulling his collar up against the gale. "The piece is well and truly shattered now. We'd best get the kettle on before the shouting starts." The wail of the sirens grew into a deafening shriek as 2 police cruisers and an unmarked black sedan fishtailed into the hotel driveway, spraying slush over Hamish's boots. The car doors hadn't even finished vibrating before Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the back seat. He was a man who resembled a disgruntled bulldog, squeezed into a suit 3 sizes too small, his face already a dangerous shade of purple that clashed violently with his regulation tie. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice cutting through the Highland wind like a rusty saw. "I might have known I'd find you standing around doing nothing while a prominent citizen is turned into a human popsicle." "I was just observing the scene, sir," Hamish said mildly, his thumbs hooked into his belt. He looked particularly vacant, leaning slightly against a stone pillar as if the effort of standing upright was almost too much to bear. "It's a sad business. The ice stag, you see, it appears to have—" "I don't need a lecture on thermodynamics from a turnip-crunching village idiot," Blair snapped. He shoved past Hamish, nearly tripping over Lugs, who let out a sharp, indignant bark. Blair kicked out at the air near the dog and stomped toward the body. Behind him trailed his 2 shadows, Detectives Anderson and MacNab, who looked at Hamish with the weary pity of city men forced to visit the provinces. Blair stood over the late Julian Vane Tempest, hands on his hips. "Obvious," he declared, not a minute into his inspection. "The deceased was drunk, tried to move this ridiculous statue, God knows why. It slipped and crushed him. Or better yet, one of these local hooligans gave it a shove. Who's the village drunk these days, Macbeth? Is it still that old scoundrel Geordie?" "Geordie's been in bed with the flu these 3 days, sir," Hamish offered gently. "And the ice stag weighs nearly a 1/4 ton. It would take more than a shove to move it from the ballroom to the lawn without a trolley. And there's the matter of the cocktail skewer in his hand." Blair whirled around, his eyes bulging. "The matter is that I am in charge. I'll decide what's a matter and what's a coincidence. It's Hogmanay, man. I'm supposed to be at the police ball in Strathbane, not freezing my tail off in this god-forsaken bog. This is an accident or a prank gone wrong. I want every person in that hotel lined up. I'll find the one who pushed it, and I'll be back in my warm bed by midnight." Blair stomped toward the hotel entrance, barking orders at Anderson to bag the skewer as if it were a piece of litter. He didn't notice, as Hamish did, that the DCI's heavy-handed footsteps were obliterating the faint ruts in the frost that showed exactly where the ice had been dragged. "You stay here and guard the perimeter, Macbeth," Blair yelled over his shoulder. "Try not to fall asleep and let the crows eat the evidence. And keep that mongrel away from the corpse." Hamish watched them go, the hotel's heavy oak doors slamming shut behind the city detectives. The wind died down for a brief second, leaving a heavy, expectant silence. Hamish looked at the ruts Blair had just trampled. He knew fine well that Julian Vane Tempest hadn't been moving statues in his dressing gown at sub-zero temperatures for a lark. "He's in a great hurry to be wrong, Lugs," Hamish murmured, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Which means we'll have to be in a great hurry to find out why Mr. Vane Tempest was out here in his slippers. And I think a cup of tea at the kitchen entrance might tell us more than Blair will get with all his shouting." Hamish waited until the last of the forensic team's flashbulbs had flickered out before making his way around to the rear of the hotel. He avoided the front lobby, where the sounds of Blair's muffled roaring and the indignant shrieks of London socialites suggested that the questioning was going about as well as a fox in a henhouse. Instead, he slipped through the heavy steam-filled air of the scullery door. The kitchen was a sanctuary of controlled panic. Mrs. Wallace, the hotel's cook, was a formidable woman whose scones were as light as her temper was heavy. She was currently standing over a massive copper pot, stirring a thick Scotch broth with enough vigour to suggest she was imagining Blair's head at the bottom of it. "Aye, Hamish," she grunted, not looking up. "I suppose you'll be wanting a dram or a dish of tea to keep the cold. Out of your lazy bones while the rest of the world works. A tea would be grand, Mrs. Wallace," Hamish said, leaning his tall frame against a flour-dusted table. "And maybe a bit of that gingerbread I smell. It's a terrible thing, a man being flattened by a stag on the very eve of the new year." Mrs. Wallace paused, her ladle dripping. Terrible? It was an inevitability, Hamish Macbeth, that Vane Tempest was a man who didn't understand the word no. He had the staff moving that ice monstrosity 4 times yesterday. First the ballroom, then the terrace, then back again because the light wasn't dramatic enough. "Is that so?" Hamish asked, his eyes sharpening even as he took a slow, appreciative bite of the gingerbread she slid toward him. "And who was it that helped him move it last? It's a heavy beast for a man in silk slippers. He had his valet, a skinny little creature called Pringle, and that local lad, Callum, doing the heavy lifting," she whispered, leaning in. "But I saw Vane Tempest arguing with his business partner, Mr. Lavenham, out by the terrace just before the guests arrived for drinks. Lavenham looked like he wanted to push Vane Tempest off the cliff, never mind under a block of ice. Something about a frozen account, which is ironic if you think about it." Hamish nodded, nursing the hot mug. "A frozen account, you say? And did any of them mention peppermint?" Mrs. Wallace frowned. "Peppermint? No. But Vane Tempest was a devil for those strong mints to hide the smell of the gin he drank like water. He had them shipped up from a chemist in London." Hamish's mind whirred. The smudge on the collar he'd seen earlier hadn't been a mint, it had been a scent, and Blair, in his rush to arrest the nearest shouting person, would never think to ask why a man clutching a cocktail skewer and smelling of peppermint would end up under a stag. "I'll just take a wander through the back corridor, Mrs. Wallace," Hamish said, pocketing a second piece of gingerbread. "For lugs, I'd hate for a guest to wander into the kitchen and disturb your broth." He moved quietly through the service hallway, a ghost in a blue uniform. He wasn't looking for fingerprints, he was looking for the things that weren't there. He reached the door to the valet's small room near the linen cupboard. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Pringle was frantically packing a suitcase, his hands shaking so violently that a bottle of silver polish clattered to the floor. "Going somewhere, Mr. Pringle?" Hamish asked softly, filling the doorway. "And the party only just getting started?" Pringle spun around, his face the colour of the very curdled milk Mrs. Wallace had discarded earlier that morning. His eyes darted toward the window, then back to Hamish's towering, deceptively relaxed form. I can't stay here, officer," the valet stammered, his fingers fumbling with the brass latches of a leather valise. "The atmosphere is quite impossible. And with Mr. Vane Tempest gone, my employment has effectively terminated. I have a sister in Brighton who is quite unwell." Hamish didn't move. He leaned against the doorframe, his hazel eyes taking in every detail of the small, cramped room. On the bedside table sat a small glass jar of white tablets, the peppermint mints Mrs. Wallace had mentioned. Brighton is a long way to go on a night when the roads are turning to glass, Mr. Pringle, and I think DCI Blair would be very annoyed if his star witness vanished before he'd even finished his first bottle of the hotel's best scotch. I saw nothing, Pringle squeaked, his voice rising an octave. I was in the pantry polishing the New Year's silver. Ask anyone. I'm sure you were, Hamish said soothingly, but I'm wondering why a man who was so busy with silver has a smudge of motor oil on his cuff. It's the same oil I saw on the deceased's collar. Before Pringle could respond, the sound of light, purposeful footsteps echoed down the service corridor. Hamish straightened as Priscilla Halberton Smythe appeared. She was, as always, a vision of cool, aristocratic elegance that made Hamish feel suddenly aware of his frayed cuffs and the faint scent of wet dog clinging to his jacket. Her blonde hair was swept back, and her pale blue eyes held a spark of sharp intelligence that usually eluded the men currently shouting in the front hall. Hamish, she said, her voice a calm oasis in the evening's madness. I thought I might find you lurking where the real information is. DCI Blair is currently threatening to arrest the wine waiter for looking suspiciously French, and the guests are nearing a state of mutiny. Priscilla, Hamish nodded, a flush creeping up his neck that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. I was just having a small chat with Mr. Pringle here about travel plans. Priscilla glanced at the valet, her gaze lingering on the suitcase. She stepped into the room, the scent of her expensive perfume momentarily masking the smell of damp wool and peppermint. It's a bit late for the train, isn't it, Pringle? Especially since the Bentley's tyres appear to have been tampered with. I noticed it when I arrived. Someone let the air out of the front left. It's quite flat. Hamish felt a jolt of interest. The Bentley? The one sitting right next to where the body was found? The very same, Priscilla said, looking directly at Hamish. And I noticed something else while the Sassenachs, as you call them, were panicking. Julian wasn't wearing his own dressing gown. That silk paisley is part of a limited collection from a tailor in Savile Row. I know because my father has one. But Julian's was blue. The one he's wearing out there is a deep burgundy. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle shift. The oil, the flat tyre, the wrong gown, and the cocktail skewer. He looked at Pringle, who had gone from pale to a sickly shade of grey. A burgundy gown, Hamish mused. Now, who else in this house would be wearing the exact same expensive? Taylor. Priscilla. His business partner, Mr. Lavenham, she replied promptly. He's been pacing the library, complaining that his luggage was misplaced this afternoon. He claimed he had nothing to wear for the party but his travelling suit. Hamish sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The romantic tension between him and Priscilla was an old familiar ache, one he usually buried under layers of Highland indifference. She was the only one who truly saw through his lazy act, and her presence always forced him to sharpen his wits. She wasn't just a sounding board. She was a reminder of the world he perpetually avoided, the world of high stakes and cold motives. So, Hamish said, turning back to the trembling valet. It seems we have a man in the wrong clothes, a car that can't move, and a partner who has lost his wardrobe. Mr. Pringle, I think you'd better sit down. I'm going to need the truth, and I'm going to need it before DCI Blair decides that the wine waiter is a secret assassin for the French resistance. Priscilla stepped closer to Hamish, her hand briefly touching his arm. He's hiding something about the ice sculpture, Hamish. I saw him talking to the delivery men earlier. He seemed very insistent on where it was placed. Is that so? Hamish's voice was low. He looked at the dog, Lugs, who was now sniffing intently at the valet's shoes. Tell me, Pringle, did Mr. Vane Tempest ever mention a frozen account to you? Or was it Mr. Lavenham who was worried about the ice? The valet collapsed onto the bed, his head in his hands. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he moaned. It was just supposed to be a scare. A bit of leverage. Hamish looked at Priscilla, a grim smile touching his lips. It's never just a scare in Lochdubh, Priscilla. People here have a way of taking things to their logical and often fatal conclusion. I think it's time I had a quiet word with Mr. Lavenham while Blair is busy making an enemy of the catering staff. He felt the weight of the investigation shifting. It wasn't about the cold wind or the bizarre death anymore. It was about the petty, tangled greed of men who thought they could bring their city sins to the Highlands and keep them hidden under a block of ice. He needed to move fast, but in his own way. Not with sirens and shouting, but with the steady, relentless pressure of a man who knew exactly where the cracks were in the frost. Stay with him, Priscilla? Hamish asked. "I wouldn't miss the reveal for anything, Hamish," she replied, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. Hamish stepped back into the shadows of the corridor, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He didn't need a forensics lab. He had the gossip of the kitchen, the sharp eyes of a lady, and the unmistakable scent of peppermint and betrayal hanging in the freezing air. He had to find the link between the oil on the gown and the skewer in the dead man's hand, and he had to do it before the clock struck midnight, and the new year brought a fresh set of lies to his doorstep. Hamish left Priscilla to keep her cool, aristocratic eye on the wilting valet and drifted toward the library. The thick carpets of the Lochdubh hotel muffled his footsteps, making him a silent observer of the chaos Blair was still orchestrating in the main lounge. Through the half-open double doors, Hamish could see the DCI hovering over a pale, trembling young man named Callum, the local lad who helped with the heavy lifting. Blair's face was now a shade of mahogany that suggested an imminent physical event, possibly an explosion, so you just happened to be the last one to touch the sculpture, eh? Blair's voice carried through the hallway, dripping with a sarcasm that was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Needed a bit of extra cash for the new year, did we? A little accident for the rich Sassenach so you could nick his wallet in the confusion? The boy was shaking so hard his teeth were practically rattling, a sight that made Hamish's jaw tighten with a quiet, cold anger. Blair loved a simple narrative, especially one that involved a shifty local. But Hamish knew Callum didn't have the stomach for a prank, let alone a murder. Moving past the lounge, Hamish slipped into the library, where the air was heavy with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and the sharp medicinal tang of peppermint. Mr. Lavenham was there, standing by the fireplace, nursing a tumbler of whiskey with a hand that was remarkably steady. He was a silver-haired man with the polished exterior of a career financier, dressed in a sharp travelling suit that looked out of place for a New Year's Eve gala. He looked up as Hamish entered, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. "The local law," Lavenham remarked, his tone clipped and dismissive. "I trust you've come to tell me your superior has finally realised this was a tragic accident. The wind in this god-forsaken place is enough to topple a mountain, let alone a block of ice." Hamish didn't answer immediately. He wandered to a side table where a collection of silver cocktail accessories sat on a tray. He picked up a skewer, identical to the one Julian Vane Tempest had been clutching in his death throes. "The wind is a powerful thing, Mr. Lavenham," Hamish said, his voice slow and rhythmic. "But it's a selective wind that lets the air out of a Bentley's tyre and puts a man in his partner's dressing gown before crushing him. I was wondering about that gown. Priscilla Halberton Smythe tells me it's a very rare sort of silk, burgundy, and yet Julian was found in it while you're stuck in your tweed. A bit of a mix-up with the luggage, was it?" Lavenham's grip on his glass tightened for a fraction of a second. "A common error in the rush of arrival. Our bags are identical. He must have grabbed mine by mistake and wandered out to check the sculpture. He was obsessed with that stag, you know, wanted it positioned just so to impress the neighbours he despised." "And the skewer?" Hamish asked, holding the silver needle up to the firelight. Was he planning on stabbing the ice into submission? Or perhaps he thought the stag looked a bit hungry. Lavenham let out a dry, rattling laugh. Julian was eccentric. He likely took it to scrape at a detail he didn't like. He was a perfectionist, a trait that unfortunately led to his demise. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I find the company of the police, even the rural variety, to be quite taxing." Hamish nodded, his expression one of mild apology. "Of course, sir. I'll just be out of your way. I've a dog to feed and a DCI to pacify." He turned to leave, but as he passed the heavy mahogany desk near the window, his foot accidentally kicked a small wastepaper basket, overturning it. Out rolled a crumpled receipt and a small, greasy rag. Hamish bent down, his long fingers snatching the rag before Lavenham could move. He sniffed it. It didn't smell like silver polish. It smelled of heavy motor oil, the same scent he had detected on the burgundy collar. "You've a messy valet, or perhaps a messy partner," Hamish remarked, tucking the rag into his pocket. He left the library before Lavenham could respond, his mind clicking through the evidence. Blair was currently in the hallway, triumphantly clicking a pair of handcuffs onto Callum's wrists. The boy was weeping openly now while the hotel guests watched with a mixture of horror and relief that the criminal had been caught. "There!" Blair shouted, spotting Hamish. "Case closed, Macbeth." The boy admitted he moved the stag for the deceased. He clearly didn't set the brakes on the trolley properly, or he did it on purpose. "Either way, it's manslaughter. I'll have the confession beaten out of him by sunrise. You can go back to your poaching now." Hamish looked at the obvious suspect, a terrified local boy who could barely lift a heavy tray, let alone a quarter-ton of ice without help. He looked at the smug DCI, who was already mentally writing his commendation for the police ball. Then he thought of the oil on the rag, the flat tire on the Bentley, and the silver skewer. The skewer wasn't for the ice. It was a tool. Julian hadn't been attacking the stag. He had been trying to fix something. "You've got your man, sir," Hamish said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "A brilliant piece of work. Truly." Blair puffed out his chest, oblivious to the frost in Hamish's eyes. "Of course it is. Now get this rabble cleared out. I want to be on the road in 20 minutes. As Blair marched his prisoner toward the cruisers, Hamish stood in the shadows of the porch, lugs at his side. He knew the red herring had been served on a silver platter, and Blair had swallowed it whole. But the real motive wasn't in a boy's clumsiness or a gust of wind. It was buried in the frozen account Mrs. Wallace had mentioned, and the oily rag in his pocket. The crime wasn't a tragedy of errors, it was a carefully staged execution that relied on the very arrogance and incompetence Blair was currently displaying. Hamish waited until the tail lights of the police cars vanished into the swirling snow before turning back toward the hotel. He had 2 hours before the new year began, and he intended to spend them setting a trap of his own. He needed to find the one person who truly knew why the Bentley wouldn't start and why Julian Vane Tempest had died, trying to prove he was still the man in charge. The red herring was gone, leaving the path clear for the hidden motive to finally emerge from the Highland mist. The silence that followed the departure of the police cruisers was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the eaves of the Lochdubh hotel. Hamish stood on the gravel, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the red glow of the taillights vanish into the darkness. To any onlooker, he appeared defeated, a simple village bobby outclassed and silenced by his superior. But beneath the unruly ginger hair, Hamish's mind was moving with the cold, calculated precision of a stalking cat. He reached into his pocket and felt the oily rag, then the small notebook where he had scribbled a few words from Mrs. Wallace. The hidden motive was no longer a vague shadow. It was beginning to take the shape of a very specific, very desperate human greed. It was never just about a frozen account in the financial sense. In the Highlands, things tended to be much more literal and much more personal. He turned and walked back into the hotel, bypassing the lingering guests who were now whispering in huddled groups. He found Priscilla waiting for him in the small morning room, her expression unreadable. She had a way of standing that made the drafty, old-fashioned room look like a palace chamber. "He's taken Callum," she said, her voice low. "You know the boy is innocent, Hamish. He couldn't kill a fly, much less plan a murder that looks like a freak weather event." Hamish nodded, his eyes fixed on a painting of a Highland glen on the far wall. "I know that, Priscilla, and Blair knows it too, deep down, but he'd rather be wrong and warm in Strathbane than right and shivering in Lochdubh. The motive isn't in Callum's pockets, it's in the Bentley." "The Bentley?" Priscilla asked, stepping closer. Hamish pulled out the oily rag. "This rag was in the library. It's covered in the same lubricant used for high-end engine parts. And that cocktail skewer Julian was holding, it wasn't for ice. If you have a puncture, or if someone has jammed a valve with a bit of grit, a thin, sharp tool is exactly what you'd use to try and clear it. Julian wasn't out there admiring the stag. He was trying to fix his car. He was in a hurry to leave, Priscilla. A very great hurry." Hamish led her back toward the service area, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Mrs. Wallace overheard them talking about a frozen account. Everyone assumed it meant a bank had stopped their funds, but Julian was a man who lived for the raw Highland experience. He'd been bragging about the vintage malts he'd found in the cellar of the Heights. He'd discovered a stash of Macallan from the 1920s hidden behind a false wall. The pieces began to click into place. Julian Vane Tempest hadn't just been a wealthy Sassenach. He had been a collector, a man who viewed the Highlands as a treasure chest to be looted. The motive wasn't the money in the bank, Hamish continued, his gaze drifting toward the kitchen where Pringle was still being watched by the hotel porter. It was the whiskey. Lavenham and Julian weren't just business partners, they were rivals in the acquisition of rare spirits. "Lavenham is broke, Priscilla. His firm in London is a hollow shell. He needed those bottles to settle a debt with some very unpleasant people. Julian found out Lavenham had already sold the frozen assets, the bottles, before they were even out of the ground. So Julian was going to expose him? Priscilla asked, her eyes widening. Tonight, during the toast, he was going to announce the disappearance of the vintage stock to the very people Lavenham had promised it to. He was going to humiliate him. Hamish nodded. Julian went to his car to get his own private bottle for the toast, the proof of the theft. But Lavenham had already anticipated that. He let the air out of the tyre to delay him, knowing Julian's temper. He knew Julian would try to fix it himself rather than admit he was stranded. And while Julian was bent over that wheel, in the dark, in the freezing wind, he was a sitting duck. The true darkness of the crime was in its simplicity. Lavenham hadn't needed a weapon. He had used the environment. He had moved the ice stag, likely with Pringle's coerced help, to a position of precarious balance on the terrace above the driveway. A single shove, timed with the howling wind, was all it took. The oil on the gown came from Julian's struggle with the car. The skewer was his futile tool. Lavenham had even swapped the dressing gowns earlier in the day to ensure that if any blood or oil spattered, it would be on his own lost garment, which he then placed back on Julian's body to hide the evidence of a struggle. It was a crime of petty jealousy and social preservation, masked as a tragic accident. "But how do you prove it, Hamish?" Priscilla asked, her brow furrowed. "Blair has the boy. The ice is melting. The evidence is literally turning to water." Hamish gave a small, grim smile. "Lavenham is a man of habit. He thinks he's the smartest man in the room because he's surrounded by people like Blair. He's currently in the library, probably celebrating his narrow escape with another whiskey. But he's forgotten one thing about the Highlands. We don't just listen to what people say, we listen to what the land tells us. And the land says that a man who loses his luggage doesn't usually have a spare set of identical cufflinks in his pocket." Hamish turned toward the door that led to the library, his posture shifting from the lazy policeman to something far more formidable. The hidden motive was greed, yes, but the catalyst was Julian's own arrogance. He had underestimated his partner's desperation, just as Lavenham was now underestimating Hamish. The new year was approaching. The clock on the mantel ticking down the final hour of the old year. Hamish knew he couldn't rely on forensics or a confession given to a bully like Blair. He needed to set a trap that would force Lavenham to reveal his own hand. "Wait here, Priscilla," Hamish said softly. "I need to go and see a man about a bottle of whiskey that doesn't exist. If I'm right, he won't be able to resist one last look at his frozen assets." As he walked away, Lugs followed at his heels, the dog's ears pricked, sensing the shift in his master's energy. The mystery of Lochdubh was nearing its end, but the most dangerous part, the confrontation, was just beginning to crystallize in the freezing night air. The grandfather clock in. The hotel lobby struck 11, the deep chimes vibrating through the floorboards like a warning. Hamish watched the pendulum swing, his face a mask of rustic simplicity. He knew that for a man like Lavenham, the greatest weapon wasn't a confession or a physical piece of evidence. It was the fear of being seen as a failure. Lavenham had gambled his entire reputation on the disappearance of that vintage whiskey, and Hamish intended to use that desperation as the bait for his hook. He signalled to Priscilla to remain by the morning-room door. Then he made a deliberate, noisy show of walking toward the kitchen, ensuring his heavy boots clattered against the parquet floor. He needed Lavenham to feel that the stupid policeman was finally giving up and settling in for a late-night snack. Once inside the kitchen, however, Hamish didn't reach for the teapot. He moved toward the large walk-in cold storage room, where the hotel kept its finest meats and the overflow of the New Year's champagne. "Mrs. Wallace," Hamish whispered, startling the cook as she was wiping down the central island, "I need you to do me a very specific favour, and it involves that loud, silver-tongued gentleman in the library. I need you to go in there and tell him, quietly mind you, that the police have found a crate in the cellar that wasn't on the hotel's inventory. Tell him PC Macbeth is currently struggling to open it because the lock is unusually sophisticated and that I'm worried it might contain something illegal that would require me to call DCI Blair back from Strathbane immediately." Mrs. Wallace narrowed her eyes, her sharp Highland mind instantly grasping the shape of the ruse. "You want me to tell him you're poking around his frozen assets, do you? Very well, Hamish. But if he breaks a chair over your ginger head, don't come crying to me for a bandage." She untied her apron and marched toward the library with the grim determination of a woman who enjoyed seeing an arrogant Sassenach. Squirm. Hamish retreated into the shadows of the cold storage room, leaving the door slightly ajar. He didn't turn on the light. Instead, he sat on an overturned milk crate, lugs settling silently at his feet. The air in the room was bone-chilling, smelling of raw beef and frost, but Hamish didn't move. He waited. He knew the psychology of a man like Lavenham. Lavenham wouldn't be able to stay in that library, not if he thought his stolen prize, the 1920s Macallan, had been discovered by a local policeman who was too dim to know its value but just diligent enough to report it to his superior. If Lavenham thought he could help Hamish dispose of the crate, or perhaps convince him it was merely a private gift for the deceased, he would come running. Minutes ticked by. The only sound was the hum of the refrigeration unit and the distant howl of the wind outside. Then the rhythmic thud-click of expensive leather shoes echoed in the hallway. The kitchen door creaked open. Hamish held his breath. He saw the sliver of light from the kitchen widen as a shadow fell across the floor. Lavenham entered, his movements hurried and predatory. He wasn't looking for a policeman to assist. He was looking for a threat to neutralize. He walked straight toward the back of the kitchen, toward the stairs that led to the basement cellar, but then he paused, his gaze catching the slightly open door of the cold storage. Hamish watched through the gap. Lavenham's face was no longer that of a polished financier. It was tight with a cold, murderous anxiety. He reached into his coat pocket, and for a moment Hamish wondered if he had a weapon. Instead, Lavenham pulled out a heavy brass key, the key to the Heights estate where the whiskey had been hidden. "Macbeth?" Lavenham's voice was a low, jagged hiss. "Are you in here, man?" Mrs. Wallace mentioned a crate. He stepped closer to the cold room, his curiosity and fear overriding his caution. Hamish remained perfectly still. He needed Lavenham to enter the room, to be surrounded by the very cold that had claimed Julian Van Tempest. As Lavenham pushed the heavy insulated door wide, the dim light from the kitchen spilled in, illuminating the rows of hanging carcasses and stacked crates. "There's no one here," Lavenham muttered to himself, his relief momentarily eclipsing his suspicion. He turned to leave, but his eyes caught sight of a small, rectangular wooden box Hamish had placed prominently on the centre table. It was an old tea crate, but in the shadows, it looked remarkably like the specialised packaging used for vintage spirits. Lavenham moved toward it like a moth to a flame. His hands, usually so steady, were trembling as he reached for the lid. "The fool," he whispered, a sneer twisting his lips. "The absolute Highland fool. He actually found it." As Lavenham's fingers touched the wood, Hamish stood up from the darkness behind him. "It's a fine thing, isn't it, Mr. Lavenham? The way a bit of old wood and some fermented grain can drive a man to stand in the freezing dark." Lavenham spun around, let out a strangled cry, and stumbled back against a rack of chilled venison. His face was a mask of terror, the silver hair dishevelled, the successful man finally stripped bare. I was just looking for you, Macbeth," Lavenham stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit, but Hamish was already moving, his tall frame blocking the doorway. "You were looking for the whiskey, sir. The whiskey you stole from your partner's new cellar before he could announce your fraud to the world, and you were looking for a way to make sure the stupid policeman didn't hand it over to DCI Blair." Hamish stepped into the light, his expression one of weary disappointment. "You see, in Lochdubh we have a saying about the ice. It doesn't just hide things, it preserves them. It preserved the oil on the gown, it preserved the skewer in Julian's hand, and it's preserved your guilt right here in this room." Lavenham realised then that there was no crate of Macallan. There was only an empty box and a man who had seen through every layer of his deception. The trap had snapped shut, but the cornered animal was about to show its teeth. Lavenham's hand went back into his pocket, and this time he didn't pull out a key. He pulled out a heavy, silver-plated lighter, a solid block of metal that he gripped like a knuckle-duster. "You think you've won, you ginger peasant?" Lavenham spat, the veneer of civilization finally shattering. "You have no witnesses, no proof that will stand in a city court, and after tonight you'll just be another accident in the Highland snow." He lunged forward, but Hamish didn't flinch. He had lived his whole life on these hills, and he knew that the cold didn't just kill, it made everything brittle, including the resolve of a man who had never had to fight for anything but a profit margin. Lavenham lunged with the desperation of a man whose world was dissolving into the freezing air of a meat locker. He swung the heavy silver lighter with a jagged horizontal motion aimed directly at Hamish's temple, but the financier was used to the cushioned floors of Mayfair, not the treacherous, frost-slicked concrete of a Highland scullery. As he moved, his polished leather soles found a patch of condensation near the drainage grate, and his balance betrayed him. Hamish didn't move with the frantic energy of a brawler. He simply pivoted on his heel, a move learned from years of navigating the uneven peat bogs of Sutherland. He caught Lavenham's wrist in a grip that felt like a band of cold iron. The silver lighter clattered to the floor, skidding beneath a rack of hanging beef. Lavenham let out a guttural sound of frustration and tried to throw a frantic left hook, but Hamish merely stepped into the man's personal space, using his height and leverage to pin Lavenham against the cold stone wall. "That's enough of that now, Mr. Lavenham," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that would have surprised anyone who had only seen his lazy persona. "You've already caused enough trouble for one Hogmanay. I've a young lad in a police cell who's crying his eyes out because of your handiwork, and I'm in no mood for a dance." Lavenham struggled, his face turning a mottled purple that mirrored the late DCI Blair's complexion. But the strength in Hamish's long arms was deceptive. It was the strength of a man who chopped his own wood and rowed a boat against the tide. Gradually, the fight went out of the older man, replaced by a shuddering, pathetic tremor. He slumped against the wall, the cold of the stones finally seeping through his expensive wool coat. "It was Julian," Lavenham wheezed, his eyes darting wildly. "He was going to ruin me. Over a few bottles of fermented grain. He had millions, and he wanted to destroy me for a pittance." Hamish let go of the man's wrists, but stayed close enough to block the exit. Luggs sat by the door, a silent, furry sentinel with his teeth bared in a quiet snarl. "It's never a pittance when it's someone's pride, sir," Hamish remarked, reaching down to retrieve the silver lighter. He turned it over in his hand, noting the monogram. "You pushed the stag, didn't you? You knew he'd be out there, fumbling with the car you'd disabled. You watched from the terrace, waited for the wind to howl loud enough to drown out the sound of the ice sliding, and you gave it a shove. Then you went back inside, changed your gown, and joined the party." Lavenham didn't deny it. The silence in the cold room was an admission in itself. He looked broken, a hollowed-out version of the predator who had walked into the library an hour earlier. He realized too late that he hadn't been dealing with a peasant, but with the very essence of the Highlands, something patient, observant, and impossible to bribe. The kitchen door creaked open, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped in, followed closely by Mrs. Wallace. Priscilla's eyes took in the scene, the slumped financier and the steady, quiet power of the policeman standing over him. She looked at Hamish with an expression that was almost a smile, a rare flicker of genuine admiration. "I've called the station in Strathbane," she said softly. "I didn't ask for Blair. I spoke to Sergeant MacNab. I told him there had been a development, and that the prisoner he was transporting was likely the victim of a grave procedural error." Hamish nodded his thanks. He knew Priscilla's name carried enough weight to make even the most loyal of Blair's subordinates pause. "Thank you, Priscilla. Now, if Mrs. Wallace could find a bit of sturdy rope, the kind she uses for the Sunday roasts, I think we'll just keep Mr. Lavenham here in the chill until the real police arrive to take him away." Mrs. Wallace produced the twine with alarming alacrity, and within minutes the once mighty business mogul was secured to a heavy wooden chair in the centre of the kitchen. He looked absurd, surrounded by copper pans and the smell of Scotch broth, but the absurdity was lost on him. He stared at the floor, muttering about lawyers and liquidators. Hamish stepped out of the kitchen and onto the back porch, the freezing night air hitting him like a physical blow. He pulled his pipe from his pocket but didn't light it. He just stood there, watching the snow begin to fall in thick, silent flakes that threatened to bury the night's sins. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the familiar hollow ache of a job done too well. He had solved the mystery, saved an innocent boy and caught a killer, but he knew the hardest part was still to come. He had to make sure Blair didn't find out just how smart Hamish Macbeth really was. "You're thinking about the promotion, aren't you?" Priscilla asked, appearing at his side. She had wrapped a heavy tartan shawl around her shoulders, looking every bit the Highland lady. Hamish sighed, the white plume of his breath vanishing into the dark. "If Blair finds out I did this while he was busy bullying Callum, He'll have me in an office in Glasgow by Monday. He'll hate me for making him look a fool. But the chief constable will love the heroic narrative. I can't have that, Priscilla. I like my stove. I like my dog. I even like the way the wind tries to blow my chimney down. Priscilla leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the lights of the village below. Then we'll have to make sure Blair thinks it was his own brilliant intuition that led us back here. We'll have to give him the gold, as they say. Hamish looked at her, a slow, clever grin spreading across his face. I think I know just how to do it. Blair's vanity is much larger than his memory. By the time the sun comes up, he'll be convinced he whispered the secret of the oily rag in my ear before he left for Strathbane. They stood in silence for a moment, the two of them, watching the last hour of the year tick away. The murder was solved, the killer was caught, and the village of Lochdubh was safe once more. But for Hamish, the victory was secondary to the peace. He wanted the quiet return to his routine, the simple pleasure of a pot of coffee and the knowledge that he had outmaneuvered the world without ever having to leave his glen. As the first distant firework popped over the loch, signalling the start of the new year, Hamish Macbeth finally allowed himself a small, satisfied chuckle. The trap was empty, the bird was caught, and the lazy policeman was still exactly where he wanted to be. The headlights of the returning police cruisers cut through the swirling Highland snow like the eyes of a vengeful beast. DCI Blair was the first one out of the vehicle, his face a thunderous mask of indignation. He had been halfway to Strathbane when the radio call from Sergeant MacNab had reached him, suggesting, in the most diplomatic terms possible, that there had been a significant oversight in the arrest of young Callum. Blair stomped toward the kitchen entrance, his boots slamming against the frozen ground with enough force to crack the ice. He burst through the door, ready to unleash a torrent of abuse on Hamish. But the sight that met him was so unexpected that the words died in his throat. There sat Mr. Lavenham, bound in kitchen twine, and looking utterly defeated, while Hamish stood nearby, idly scratching lugs behind the ears, and looking like a man who had just woken up from a particularly long nap. "What is the meaning of this, Macbeth?" Blair roared, though the volume was slightly diminished by his confusion. "Why is a respectable businessman tied up like a Christmas turkey? And where is that boy?" Hamish looked up, his eyes wide with a practised sort of vacant innocence. "Ah, sir, you're back. It's a good thing you mentioned that detail about the Bentley's tyres before you left. I never would have thought to check the cold storage if you hadn't planted that seed of suspicion in my mind. You were right all along. It wasn't the boy. Your intuition about the financial pressure on the guests was spot on." Blair blinked, his chest puffing out instinctively as the praise hit home. He didn't remember mentioning the tyres nor the cold storage, but the prospect of being the architect of the solution was far too tempting to deny. Well, yes. Of course I was right," Blair stammered, smoothing his lapels and trying to regain his authoritative posture. "I knew the boy was too soft for it. I only took him in to rattle the real killer's cage. A tactical manoeuvre, Macbeth. Standard procedure in the city." Hamish nodded sagely, his expression one of deep admiration. "A brilliant move, sir." Lavenham panicked the moment you drove away. He thought the coast was clear and came right for the evidence you'd suspected was hidden in the kitchen. If it weren't for your strategy, I'd have been sitting here drinking tea while the villain escaped. Priscilla Halberton Smythe watched the exchange from the shadows of the pantry, a faint, cynical smile playing on her lips. She knew exactly what Hamish was doing. He was handing Blair the glory on a silver platter, effectively burying his own cleverness under the DCI's mountain of vanity. If Blair was the hero, Hamish remained the lazy Highland bobby, unfit for promotion, unthreatening to the hierarchy, and most importantly, allowed to stay in Lochdubh. Blair turned to MacNab, who had just entered behind him. "Well, don't just stand there, MacNab. Get the cuffs on this man, and someone get a statement from Macbeth about how he followed my instructions to the letter. I'll need to write this up for the chief constable by morning. DCI Blair's Highland intuition leads to dramatic New Year arrest. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Lavenham looked up, his mouth opening to protest, to shout that the ginger policeman had tricked him, but Hamish stepped forward with a heavy hand on the man's shoulder. "Careful now, sir," Hamish whispered, "loud enough only for the prisoner. If you try to make the DCI look like a fool now, he'll make sure your stay in the Strathbane holding cells is very, very uncomfortable. Better to let a genius take the credit than to anger a man with a grudge." Lavenham looked at Blair's reddened, triumphant face and realised his words would fall on deaf ears. He slumped back into his chair, the fight finally extinguished. He was a man of the city, and he understood power. He just hadn't realized that in Lochdubh, power looked like a tall man in a frayed uniform, who wanted nothing more than a quiet life. As the detectives began to process the scene, Hamish drifted toward the back door. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain. He had protected the village, saved Callum from a life-shattering mistake, and ensured his own continued failure in the eyes of the police force. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth," Priscilla said, stepping out to join him on the porch. The snow was falling more gently now, coating the world in a pristine, deceptive white. "You've made that man believe he's Sherlock Holmes, and you've managed to stay a useless constable. Most people would want the medal." Hamish pulled his collar up, the cold air feeling clean and honest compared to the atmosphere inside the hotel. "A medal is just a bit of metal that needs polishing, Priscilla. And polishing takes time away from more important things like fishing and sleep. Besides, Blair will be so busy boasting in Strathbane that he won't come back to Lochdubh for months. That's worth more than all the gold in the Highlands." The cruisers eventually pulled away, the blue lights flickering against the snow until they were swallowed by the mist of the glen. The hotel was quiet again. The Sassenach party effectively ended by the arrest of its host. The villagers had retreated to their homes, and the local boy, Callum, had been released with a confusing pat on the back from a suddenly jovial DCI Blair. Hamish stood in the middle of the driveway, lugs at his side, looking at the melting ice stag. It was smaller now, its features blurred by the thaw, its power to harm gone. The mystery had been unravelled, the hidden motives exposed, and the credit shifted to the man most likely to appreciate it. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish murmured, the dog's tail wagging in anticipation. "The new year has started, and I haven't had a proper bit of peace yet. There's a peat fire waiting at the station, and I think I've earned a pot of coffee that doesn't taste like a crime scene." He walked away from the Grand Hotel, his silhouette disappearing into the dark, a man who had won everything by pretending he had done nothing at all. The Highlands kept their secrets, and Hamish. Macbeth was perhaps the greatest secret of them all. The first grey light of New Year's morning crept over the peaks of the Quillal, turning the waters of the Loch into a sheet of hammered pewter. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the rich, dark aroma of coffee. Hamish sat by the stove, his feet propped up on a wooden crate, watching the orange glow of the peat embers. Lugs was stretched out across the rug, twitching in his sleep as he chased imaginary rabbits through a dreamland free of ice stags and screaming detectives. The frantic energy of the night had dissipated, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Hamish reached for his mug. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into his palms, a welcome contrast to the biting chill he had endured in the hotel's cold storage. The case was officially closed, and more importantly, it was closed in a way that left him entirely invisible. A sharp knock at the door broke his reverie. Hamish didn't move, hoping that if he stayed still enough the world would forget he existed. But the knock came again, followed by the sound of the latch turning. Priscilla, Halbert and Smythe stepped inside, bringing with her a gust of fresh mountain air. She was dressed for travel, her elegant coat buttoned to the chin. She looked around the cramped, cluttered station with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and affection. "I'm heading back to the city, Hamish," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "I thought I'd see if you'd survived the night without being promoted against your will." Hamish gave her a weary smile, gesturing toward the extra stool. "I'm still here, Priscilla, and Blair is likely halfway to a commendation by now. He was so busy dictating his own heroics to the press that he forgot to ask me for a formal statement." Priscilla sat down, her presence making the small room feel suddenly much smaller. "You realize he'll take all the credit, and the village will continue to think you're the laziest policeman in the Highlands?" Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee. "That's the plan, isn't it? If the people of Lochdubh think I'm too busy napping to catch them poaching, they'll keep me around. And if the brass in Strathbane thinks I'm too stupid to handle a real crime, they'll leave me in peace. It's a delicate balance, Priscilla, but it's one that keeps the fire going and the dog fed." She shook her head, though her eyes were bright. "You're a terrible man, Hamish Macbeth. You solve a murder, save a boy's life, and catch a thief, all while making sure nobody knows you did it. It's a very lonely kind of brilliance." "It's not lonely with a good pot of coffee and a dog that doesn't talk back," Hamish replied, though there was a hint of something softer in his voice. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the clock on the wall. For a moment, the gap between their worlds, her aristocratic London life and his quiet Highland glen, seemed to vanish. But the moment passed as Priscilla stood up, brushing a stray bit of peat ash from her sleeve. "Try not to get into too much trouble while I'm gone, Hamish, and do try to eat something other than Mrs. Wallace's leftovers." She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Happy New Year, Hamish." "Happy New Year, Priscilla," he called after her. He watched through the window as her car moved down the narrow street, disappearing into the mist that still clung to the shoreline. Once she was gone, Hamish stood up and stretched, his joints popping like dry twigs. He looked at the paperwork piled on his desk, the forms Blair had demanded he fill out to corroborate the DCI's version of events. With a flick of his wrist, Hamish slid the entire stack into a drawer. It could wait. In fact, it could wait until the spring thaw for all he cared. He had a more pressing engagement, a walk along the cliffs to see if the wind had brought down any branches he could use for kindling, and perhaps a quiet look at the salmon pool he'd been eyeing before the murder had so rudely interrupted his day. The village was beginning to wake up. He could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the cottages, and the distant sound of a tractor suggested that life in Lochdubh was returning to its natural slow-motion rhythm. The Sassenach intrusion was over, the silver Bentley was being towed away, and the ice stag had long since turned into a puddle on the hotel lawn. To the world outside, nothing had changed. To the people of the village, Julian Vane Tempest's death would be a story told over drams of whiskey for years to name, a cautionary tale about the dangers of English arrogance and Highland weather, and at the centre of it all would be the story of how DCI Blair bravely saved the day, while Hamish Macbeth stood by and watched, looking for all the world like he was wondering when his next meal would arrive. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who scrambled to his feet, ears flopping with excitement. "Come on then," Hamish said, grabbing his cap and his walking stick. "The new year is here, and there's a peace in the air that needs tending to." As he stepped out onto the gravel path, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant golden light over the glen. The air was sharp and cold, but it felt right. He had protected his home, he had kept his secrets, and he had managed to remain exactly where he belonged. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a rising star of the CID, and he certainly wasn't a man who cared for medals. He was just Hamish Macbeth, the local policeman. And as he began his slow, rhythmic trek toward the hills, he knew that for today at least, that was more than enough. The Highlands were quiet once more, and in the heart of Lochdubh, the lazy policeman was back on his beat, watching everything and saying nothing at all. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the coastal mist and revealing the stark, ancient beauty of the Sutherland peaks. Hamish paused on the ridge overlooking the village, leaning on his hazel stick. From this height, Lochdubh looked like a child's toy set, peaceful and indifferent to the dramas of men. The Bentley was a mere silver speck being hauled toward the main road, a final remnant of the chaos Julian Vane Tempest had brought to the glen. Hamish adjusted his cap, feeling a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. The mystery hadn't been solved by sirens or fingerprint powder, but by the steady, quiet accumulation of truths that the outsiders were too impatient to see. He turned his gaze toward the heights, the looming estate on the cliff. Somewhere in that cellar, a fortune in vintage whiskey remained hidden, now likely to be tied up in probate and legal squabbles for a decade. It was frozen in truth now, protected by the very bureaucracy that Lavenham had tried to manipulate. Hamish gave a short, dry chuckle. There was a poetic justice in it. The greed that had fueled a murder had resulted in no one getting a single drop of the prize. The Highlands had a way of swallowing the ambitions of the greedy, leaving them with nothing but the cold wind for company. As he began the descent back toward the village, he passed Archie McLean, who was out checking a fence line. Archie stopped and spat on the ground, nodding toward the departing police van in the distance. "A busy night for the big men from the city, Hamish," Archie remarked, his eyes twinkling with a knowing Highland skepticism. "I hear that DCI Blair is a regular genius. Caught the killer while you were probably having a nap in the scullery." "Aye, Archie," Hamish replied, his voice thick with a deceptive, slow-witted drawl. "A terrifying man, that Blair. He sees things the rest of us just walk right past." I was lucky he was there to tell me what was what, or I'd still be wondering why the ice was so heavy. Archie let out a bark of laughter and went back to his work, satisfied that his local policeman was as useless as ever. Hamish continued on, his step light. This was the true victory, the preservation of his cover. In the eyes of the village and the force, he was still the same slouching, ginger-haired daydreamer. He had traded fame for freedom, and in Hamish's world, that was the only bargain worth making. He reached the police station and found a small package left on the step, a tin of high-quality coffee and a brief, unsigned note in elegant script for the man who sees what isn't said. Hamish smiled, tucking the note into his pocket. Priscilla would always be a complication, a reminder of a life he could have had if he were a different sort of man, but for now the coffee was enough. He entered the station, the warmth of the lingering peat fire welcoming him home. He filled the kettle, the familiar hiss of the water providing a soothing soundtrack to the morning. Lugs trotted over to his bowl, looking up expectantly. "Aye, I know," Hamish muttered, reaching for a bit of dried venison. Breakfast for the hero's dog, and a quiet hour for the man. He sat in his favourite chair, the one with the spring that poked him in the hip if he didn't lean just right, and watched the steam rise from his mug. The new year had begun with blood and ice, but it was settling into the familiar rhythms of the seasons. There would be sheep to find, gossip to filter, and salmon to borrow from the river. As the clock on the mantel ticked toward noon, P.C. Hamish Macbeth closed his eyes, drifting into a well-earned doze. The killer was in a cell, the innocent were free, and the peace of Lochdubh was once again as solid as the mountains that stood guard over the loch.